You don't notice it at first. That's the most dangerous part. Fear rarely arrives announcing itself with shaking hands or racing breath. It doesn't always feel like panic. Sometimes it feels like practicality. Sometimes it feels like maturity. Sometimes it disguises itself as common sense, whispering that you're being careful, that you're being realistic, that you're simply adapting to how the world works. And because of that disguise, it slips quietly into the driver's seat of your life while you're busy telling yourself that you're still in control. It usually begins in ordinary moments. A hesitation before sending a message you've already rewritten 3 times. A pause before speaking up in a meeting, even though you know exactly what you want to say. A choice to stay where you are instead of risking a step forward. None of these moments feel dramatic on their own. They feel small, reasonable, almost invisible. But fear doesn't need drama to be powerful. It only needs time. And over time, those small, reasonable hesitations start forming a pattern. One you don't immediately recognize as fear because it feels so familiar, so integrated into your daily thinking that it begins to sound like your own voice. Fear is patient. It doesn't rush you. It waits for moments of vulnerability, moments when you're tired, uncertain, or quietly disappointed. It waits until you've been hurt just enough to start believing that caution is wisdom. And once it finds that opening, it doesn't tell you to stop living. It simply suggests adjustments. Lower your expectations. Don't try so hard. Avoid what hasn't worked before. Protect yourself. These suggestions feel gentle. They feel caring. They feel like self-preservation. And in many ways, they are. But preservation is not the same as growth, and safety is not the same as fulfillment. Fear knows this, even if you don't. What makes fear especially dangerous is that it rarely argues with you. It agrees. It nods along as you explain why now isn't the right time, why you're not ready yet, why the risk is too high. It reinforces your reasons with memories of past mistakes, past rejections, past losses. It shows you evidence. Look what happened last time. Look how much that hurt. Look how exposed you felt. And because those memories are real, because the pain was real, fear's logic feels unshakable. It doesn't feel like an enemy. It feels like an advisor who has studied your life very closely. Over time, fear starts shaping not just your decisions, but your identity. You begin to see yourself as someone who doesn't take certain risks, who doesn't want certain things, who isn't built for certain paths. You stop calling these limits fear. You call them personality. You call them preference. You call them knowing yourself. And maybe part of that is true. But the question you stop asking is whether those limits came from clarity or from quiet retreat, whether they were chosen consciously or simply inherited from moments when fear was loud and you were tired. There is a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from living under fear's guidance. It's not the exhaustion of doing too much. It's the exhaustion of holding yourself back, of constantly monitoring your impulses, filtering your desires, negotiating with your own curiosity. It's the fatigue of restraint. And the strange thing is that this exhaustion doesn't always feel like suffering. Sometimes it feels like numbness, like neutrality. Like life has flattened into something manageable, predictable, safe. But deep down, there's often a low, persistent ache, the sense that something important is being postponed indefinitely. Fear thrives in the future. It pulls your attention forward, projecting outcomes you haven't experienced yet and treating them as inevitable. If you try this, you'll fail. If you speak, you'll be misunderstood. If you leave, you'll regret it. If you stay, at least you know what you're dealing with. Fear presents these futures with such vivid detail that your body reacts as if they're already happening. Your chest tightens, your stomach sinks, your shoulders tense. And because the body feels the threat, the mind follows, crafting explanations that justify avoidance. This is how fear becomes self-reinforcing. The more you listen to it, the more evidence it seems to have. But here's the quiet truth most people don't like to confront. Fear is not trying to destroy you. It's trying to protect you. It evolved to keep you alive, not fulfilled. And in a world where survival once depended on avoiding physical danger, fear did its job well. The problem is that modern life is filled with psychological risks that don't threaten your survival but do threaten your sense of self. Rejection, failure, visibility, change. Fear treats these as if they are mortal threats, even when they're not. And because your nervous system can't easily tell the difference, fear reacts with the same urgency it would to a real danger. This is why fear often takes over without you noticing. It doesn't feel like panic. It feels like reason. It feels like caution. It feels like maturity. It feels like learning from experience. And sometimes it is all of those things. But sometimes it's also the quiet force narrowing your world, shrinking your range of motion, and slowly convincing you that the life you once imagined was unrealistic, childish, or naive. Fear doesn't take your dreams away all at once. It just asks you to set them down for now, and then for a little longer, and then indefinitely. There is a moment, often much later, when people begin to sense that something has gone wrong. It might arrive as restlessness or dissatisfaction, or a vague sense of regret that doesn't attach itself to any single decision. It's the feeling of having followed the rules, made the safe choices, avoided the obvious mistakes, and still ending up with a life that feels smaller than it could have been. That moment can be unsettling, because by then, fear is deeply embedded in your habits. It has shaped your routines, your relationships, your sense of what's possible, and questioning it feels risky, almost irresponsible. But awareness, once it begins, is hard to silence. You start to notice how often your first instinct is to pull back rather than lean in. How often you say no before you fully considered saying yes. How often you talk yourself out of things that once excited you. And slowly, a new question emerges, one that fear doesn't like very much. What if the voice guiding my decisions isn't wisdom, but avoidance? What if the thing I'm calling safety is actually stagnation? This question doesn't demand immediate action. It doesn't require dramatic change. In fact, trying to overthrow fear all at once often backfires, making it louder and more defensive. What it asks for instead is attention, curiosity, a willingness to observe your own reactions without immediately obeying them, to notice when fear speaks, what it says, and how it feels in your body. Not to judge it, but to recognize it, because fear loses some of its power the moment it is seen clearly. There is a profound difference between feeling fear and being ruled by it. Feeling fear is unavoidable. Being ruled by it is not. The shift begins when you realize that fear's presence does not automatically mean danger, and that discomfort is not the same as harm. It begins when you allow fear to exist without letting it decide. When you pause long enough to ask whether the choice in front of you is driven by genuine alignment or by the desire to avoid discomfort at all costs. As this awareness grows, fear doesn't disappear. It rarely does, but it changes its position. It moves from the center of your decision-making to the edge. It becomes information rather than instruction, a signal rather than a command. And in that shift, something else begins to emerge. A quieter voice, less urgent, less dramatic, but often more truthful. The voice that asks what you actually want, not what will keep you safest. The voice that understands that a meaningful life will inevitably include uncertainty, vulnerability, and risk. When fear takes over without you noticing, it doesn't ruin your life in obvious ways. It simply keeps it smaller than it needs to be. And noticing that fact, really noticing it, is not a failure. It's the beginning of a different relationship with yourself. One where fear is acknowledged, respected, but no longer in charge. Where decisions are made not from the absence of fear, but from the presence of awareness. And that shift, subtle as it may seem, has the power to change everything. That awareness doesn't arrive with fireworks. It arrives quietly, often when you're alone, when the noise of the day fades, and there's nothing left to distract you from your own thoughts. It arrives in the pause before sleep, or in the middle of a routine you've repeated so many times it no longer requires attention. And in that quiet, you begin to sense how many of your choices were shaped not by desire, but by the need to feel safe. Not safe in the physical sense, but emotionally intact, unchallenged, unexposed. You realize that fear didn't force you into a corner. It gently guided you there, step by step, until the walls felt normal. Once you see this, it becomes impossible to unsee. You start recognizing fear's fingerprints everywhere. In the way you hesitate before committing, always leaving an exit open. In the way you downplay your ambitions so disappointment won't sting as much if they fail. In the way you convince yourself that wanting more is greedy, unrealistic, or ungrateful. Fear is clever like that. It reframes retreat as humility, avoidance as patience, and self-denial as virtue. And because these traits are often praised, fear hides behind them effortlessly. There is a particular moment that defines this shift in perception. It's when you realize that many of the decisions you thought were logical were actually emotional, that the rational explanation came later, after the feeling had already decided. Fear works faster than thought. It acts in milliseconds, tightening muscles, narrowing attention, flooding the body with signals designed to pull you away from perceived danger. The mind then arrives to clean up the story, to make the retreat sound reasonable. By the time you're aware of the choice, it already feels settled, justified, final. This is why fear is so difficult to confront directly. It doesn't announce itself as fear. It shows up as a conclusion, a sense of certainty that this path is wrong, that this risk isn't worth it, that this version of you is unrealistic. And because certainty feels comforting, you rarely question where it came from. You accept it, build your plans around it, and move on. Over time, these accepted certainties accumulate, shaping a life that feels stable but strangely hollow, predictable but quietly unsatisfying. At some point, you may notice a gap between who you are and who you might have been. Not in a dramatic, cinematic way, but in subtle comparisons. A fleeting thought when you see someone else take a risk you once considered. A pang of envy that quickly turns into dismissal. They're different from me. They're braver. They had more support. They got lucky. These explanations protect you from a more uncomfortable truth. That you once stood at a similar edge, felt the same fear, and stepped back. Not because you couldn't move forward, but because fear convinced you that stepping back was wiser. Fear doesn't just influence what you do. It influences what you believe is possible. It shrinks your imagination first, then your actions follow. You stop picturing alternative futures. You stop asking certain questions. You stop entertaining certain desires. And eventually, you forget that you ever wanted them. This forgetting is one of fear's greatest victories. Because you can't grieve what you no longer remember wanting. You simply adjust, adapt, and tell yourself that this is who you are now. But beneath that adaptation, something often stirs. A restlessness that doesn't go away. A sense that your life is running efficiently, but not meaningfully. You may not be able to name what's missing, only that something feels muted. Like you're watching your own life through glass, participating without fully inhabiting it. This feeling is not a sign that you've failed. It's a signal, a quiet reminder that fear may have taken up more space than you realized. When you begin to sit with that discomfort instead of numbing it, something important happens. You start noticing the difference between fear-based discomfort and growth-based discomfort. One contracts you, the other stretches you. One makes you smaller, the other feels unsettling but expansive. Fear-based discomfort urges you to retreat, to close off, to protect. Growth-based discomfort asks you to stay present, to tolerate uncertainty, to move forward without guarantees. They can feel similar in the body, but they lead in opposite directions. Learning to tell them apart takes time. It requires patience with yourself and a willingness to be imperfect. It means allowing fear to speak without immediately obeying it. letting the wave rise without letting it steer. This is not about becoming fearless. Fearlessness is a myth. It's about becoming aware enough that fear no longer makes decisions on your behalf while pretending to be your voice. As this awareness deepens, your relationship with fear begins to change. You stop seeing it as an enemy to defeat or a weakness to eliminate. You start seeing it as a part of you that learned its lessons in a different era, under different conditions. A part that still believes safety is the highest good. You can acknowledge its presence without letting it dominate. You can thank it for trying to protect you and still choose differently. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, your world begins to expand again. Not because fear is gone, but because it's no longer in charge. You begin to make choices that feel heavier, slower, more intentional. Choices that don't offer immediate relief, but align more closely with who you are becoming. There may still be regret. There may still be mistakes. But they carry a different weight now. They are not the result of unconscious retreat, but conscious engagement. When fear takes over without you noticing, it narrows your life quietly. When you notice it, really notice it, you reclaim something essential. Not certainty, not control, but agency. The ability to choose even in the presence of fear. And that ability, once rediscovered, changes the texture of everything that follows.